Sure. Should we get started?
Yeah, but this, okay. So, when I came in this room just now, I was like, this room is not conducive to teaching case studies at all. So we just have to work with it, which is something that we'll get to later at the end when we talk about challenges of working with case studies. But I thought maybe we would just introduce ourselves, and then we would talk a little bit, as a group, and kind of go through what is a case and how cases are used in different types of cases. So I'm Jessie Myler, and I teach in environmental science, and I started using case studies probably about 3 years ago, and totally got hooked. And I love teaching with case studies, especially to non-science majors or to people that are taking classes that don't necessarily want to be in that class, like using gen ed, talking about gen ed courses. So I think that they're a really good tool for introducing real life situations, and we'll go into why those things are. But so these are my colleagues, David Hunter, and we'll go to him first, and then we'll go down. Go ahead, David.
I'm David Hunter. I'm a law professor in the law school. Every day in the law school, we teach with the case method. I'll talk a little bit about that and why we do that. It's not completely transferable, but some of the aspects are. But then also, I use a lot of different types of case studies in my own teaching, and I'll talk as well. I teach in the environmental area and in the international law area. I direct our international legal studies program, which has nothing to do with the case studies. And I'll talk specifically about a semester-long, pretty complicated and integrated case study that we did just as an outlier of kind of across 4 different classes and things like that. So. Happy to be here.
I'm Boaz Atzili, and I'm in SAS. I'm teaching mostly in the area of international security, and I've been using case studies in my classes. I think for 4 years now, and I use them. We'll hear later, but in a much less, I guess, formal sense. But a lot of case studies of conflicts, wars, crises, stuff like that.
So just want to get a sense, I know that actually a lot of people use case studies, but who actually thinks that they're using case studies in the classroom already? Jim, yeah, we talked about that a little bit. And you're in, remind me, right. Anyone else? Case study, yeah? What department or what?
School international.
Okay. You guys both?
School of Public Affairs.
Okay.
In the journalism and film school.
Oh, okay. So I bet that actually other people use aspects of case studies or parts of case studies in their classes that they teach as well, even if you're not really thinking, I'm using a case study right now. So let's just throw some things out there. What are some different characteristics of a case study? What is a case study? So.
Real life.
Real life. Okay. Anyway, go ahead. Keep going. Keep them coming.
Critical thinking.
What about critical thinking?
Did you have to?
Ah.
Not just, if there's applying what you know to create a theory or to a new situation, namely that
Extrapolation.
black and white. There's no right or wrong answer.
Okay.
Dilemmas.
Say again?
Dilemmas.
And then go ahead.
I was going to say an event that has an easily identifiable beginning and end.
Okay.
Perhaps. Maybe it's open. Question.
Okay, so something that had an event. You said an event?
Mm-hmm.
So using an event.
So I've used it as taking a look at a film
Mm-hmm.
and how from beginning to end it's put on for Frontline, for example. They have case studies of how films are done and how did you do the technical aspects of it, but also the dilemmas, the critical thinking that went into it.
Okay. And so that actually is, that would be an example of something very specific where there's a finite beginning and a finite end, but it's also, you're bringing in real life and critical thinking.
They're messy and ambiguous as opposed to
textbook problems.
I
which
see,
are
okay,
clear and-
okay. So is that, well, we won't get into the pros and the cons of that yet. Okay, ambiguous? I'm not gonna write messy, but we know where that's coming from.
I want to say something about events, because I agree about the event as the focus of this thing that has multiple dimensions that you kind of bring together, but I know in IR, we do country case studies and things like that that are less event-focused and maybe situational focused. So
Okay.
my trouble with case studies is they mean so many things.
They need so many things?
They
Mean.
mean so
Oh,
many
they
things.
mean so many
Yeah.
things,
So many
yes.
people
Such a
use
wide
it in
range.
ways.
Which is why when I wrote the proposal for this, I got rejected, and because I wanted to do it specific to science and what I'm doing. And then talking to Anna, and she's like, but it's so much more, and it is. It's so much more. So after talking to Boaz and to David, we're coming in from lots of different angles and using these case studies, and certainly the more traditional approach of either from law school and from business school of using case studies versus Boaz and I a little bit more non-conventional of use of case studies in disciplines that maybe you don't think of as using case studies as often. So yes, they mean so many different things to different disciplines, to different people, and how they're used.
I think there's also usually multiple stakeholders.
Right.
And
Okay.
those stakeholders are trying to apply solutions to different problems within the case.
So when
So
you have the
identifying the problem
dilemmas,
itself
right,
is
so
the
dilemmas are the problems, and there are different perspectives or stakeholders, right, okay. So, and because we said sometimes they're very ambiguous and also often complicated as well, right? There might not be a clear protagonist or antagonist, right? Sometimes it's more ambiguous than that, and there are multiple perspectives to it. What are some other, yeah?
Usually some ethical dilemma, or within dilemmas, but
Yeah.
usually some ethical implications
Okay.
can be present,
I'm gonna,
depending on the field, I suppose.
sure, could be ethical. And this, we want to keep it broad because depending on the field, it means different things. Some of the people that just came in, we're talking about different characteristics of a case, and maybe that you have firsthand knowledge of them, or things that you've been exposed to. Any other?
I think of them as interactive more than some other things.
Always written by Harvard professors.
Did you see my slide before? Okay. I'm not gonna write that one up there. Yeah,
I would
Boaz.
add just one more, that sometimes the case themselves is important, so you want the students to actually also learn the historical case or the substance of the case themselves beyond being a tool for learning.
So, a tool and content.
And the content.
Or the
yeah.
material. Okay.
Like learning famous legal cases.
Yeah.
Like knowing Plessy versus Ferguson or
Yeah.
and those things.
As I get lower, my handwriting gets, and I can't reach up there anymore. But, okay, what else are we missing here?
I think it's worth repeating, and it's obvious, but it was what was said before. They're really widely variable. There's such a wide range that even as we try to define it, there's no one size fits all.
Can I mention about methodology too as another thing that distinguishes? I use categorical case studies, so we have 16 categories, but if you read anthropological ones, they're much less categorical and they're more narratives or stories almost. So the methodologies really differ too in how you approach these things. I try to have a little lecture on this in my class, so I'm hoping to learn more here today about the different disciplines and how my discipline fits into case studies and how people use them effectively.
And certainly what we're going to talk about too is not exhaustive, or we're not going to be able to cover everything. When we first sat down to talk about this, or even emailing back and forth, it was huge. And so we had to kind of narrow it down to at least get out there first. What is a case? What is a case study? And then talking a little bit about some of the characteristics of a good case study. And then talking about some of the examples. But when we talk about the examples, obviously we can't cover them all. So, but we want you guys to chime in as well as we're going through some of the examples, because some of you guys have been using them for probably longer than us, and you have other examples that are relevant to other disciplines. Anything else we need to add up here? Okay. So do you want to do that thing? Courtney, will you, or maybe Boaz can, okay.
Just maximize it.
It's just not in the PowerPoint.
So there was, we don't have a lot of slides, but there was one slide that we wanted to
There we go.
show with, there was a, there were a couple different, and these kind of come into what is a case and what makes it good, the characteristics of a good case study that was actually, this is like 20 years old from Harvard Business School. I thought that's why you said that. Yes. But Boaz does not like this at all because he's MIT, so it's no way. This is no good. And
Harvard put out a series of case studies, and wasn't that like a grant-funded thing they did?
oh yeah, no, I'm just saying this list that they
That's why
came.
we associated with them.
Yes.
With Harvard.
Yes, yes. And actually, you can go online. A lot of the case study history that you see out there is actually, and a lot of it comes from business schools too. So, so these are some of the attributes of what Harvard Business School deems a good case. But we can talk about these individually because someone mentioned telling a story, some telling a story. Jim said some tell a story and some don't. But they put that up there as number one. Why would telling a story be important to a good case?
Well, I'm a journalism professor, and
Yeah.
everybody can follow a story much better than
Mhm.
anything expository.
Okay,
If you have a story, a narrative is much more effective.
right.
I mean, any level of reader is likely to be engaged by a story.
Why? Why are they more engaged by a story?
I always thought it was hardwired.
I think it's people who tend to care more about, what story you have, situations and characters people can identify with that, rather than something like an exposition. It's like, versus something like if you use Henrietta Lacks and what happened to her and her, with her cancer. And people
Right.
sort of, if that was just an exposition, people are like, oh, that's kind of messed up. But if you see it as a story, like you start to feel for the characters, you actually start to internalize and empathize, and you're like, okay.
That's a really good
Human
example.
element.
So, being able to relate something that is real life relevant or holds real life relevance is part of it. However, it doesn't always need to tell a story to do that, to evoke that sort of response. It doesn't have to tell a story to do that, but it is something that would help you to use a case that actually does tell a story. And it could be as simple as a really simple story like, Maria went into the store and you could develop it as a single person that the reader associates with, or it could be much more complicated like Boaz is going to get into when he talks about his examples that do tell stories, but they're on a much higher level than just a simple narrative. Okay, but the second one, so set in the past 5 years, and this one, Boaz, I'll let you talk about that a little bit, because that's...
when I read it, I said it's not necessarily the case. In my opinion, at least, historical cases that happened many years ago can be as good for this if they are telling a good story. So one of the cases I'm using in my classes often is World War I. Okay, it's 100 years now, but it's a very good story with lots of different dilemmas and many actors. So I think this criteria is not necessarily always.
Yeah, but this was written for business cases.
It is.
Yes, that's
And if
fair.
you use this as
Correct.
kind of like a standard to look for these things, but not every single one of them, obviously. It's like anything, right? It's any kind of level of standards or they're guidelines.
Yeah.
And
I would imagine that even in business, there are some examples of cases from 20 years ago which will be very relevant and educational for the students to learn.
The trouble in business is, although I agree with you, if you use a much older case, interest rates may be very different, accounting principles may be different, financial assumptions may be different, and that tends to disconnect the student a bit with the reality. So I mean, they're all tried and true cases, but students don't feel connected to them.
well, and I
It
think
was
that
the
gets at different
1940
disciplines too, right? I
Oh,
mean,
yeah,
because
yeah.
from science perspective too, there are many things that change even within 5 years. They could be very outdated, and so keeping them as current as possible for the cases that I use is important to me. And there are cases that I started using 3 years ago that I can no longer use because they're already outdated. Like one on light bulbs, that's use of whether or not to use CFL light bulbs. Well, you got to now. So, I mean, as of January
Kodak and film.
2014.
Kodak and film.
Right. I mean, there are
Kodak
things that
does.
are just, right? They're outdated.
One of my favorites on outdated is that I have a case in law school just that they read that says, "Here comes the fuzz." And none of my students any longer know why it is when somebody yelled, "Here come the fuzz," that everybody ran for the door and started a melee in a bar, because nobody knows what the reference to the fuzz is. And I know it's generational. How many of you know what the "Here come the fuzz" means? Raise your hand. Yeah, it's the police, for those who don't know. But it cracks me up because nobody, not a single one of my students now understands why they ran for the bar, ran out of the bar
You
one.
ever watch 1970s movies? I mean, the series Starsky and Hutch.
Sorry, that was a complete digression.
That's okay, but but that's relevant to your class too. I mean, if you're using something, and
Well, it's
especially a
relative to the
story,
currency.
an older story, right, or
Correct,
situation, and someone already mentions creates empathy, right? I mean, so through the story, through the narrative, creating empathy to either an individual personality or persona, a character, or to the situation, yeah.
Use the phrase burning Madoff.
Oh yeah.
And say that it's not necessarily empathy, it's some sort of human connection. But in a lot of business schools, it's how these guys really messed it up and how are you going to fix it. And if you get empathy from that, something's wrong with you.
That's probably true. That's interesting. Yeah, that's probably true. So it is the connection.
Yeah.
Yeah, the connection. That's a really good
Bernie
point.
is not a good example.
But he's out there, and you think of, go back to Ivan Boesky or a whole series of cases about pretty degenerate individuals, but there's nonetheless the protagonist.
And see, you raise an example also, and that's a real life example, right? I did want to mention, and this is a little bit of an aside, these examples could be made up also. They can be contrived, but to illustrate a real life example. It does not have to be a real life figure or something that actually did happen. It could be something that could happen. That's plausible, that could really happen. Obviously, you said it's relevant, relative to the readers, that they can relate to it. Serves a teaching function. So that gets back to the tool. There's a tool, but it's also the delivery of the content or the material that you're trying to get across. And dilemmas, someone mentioned dilemmas or problems. And the generality or expandability of the case or scalability to different disciplines or different concepts is really important, especially when you have a case that covers multiple classes. You want to be able to have that apply to other parts of your course, because if you're taking up classes with this and not necessarily just standing up there and lecturing, you want to make sure that it is being able to be, to be expanded to other parts of the class, or at least go across disciplines, as David's going to talk a little bit about too. And so you want to make sure that it does have, especially if it's a longer case, it does have that generality, that aspect of generality.
Can I just add that it's especially important for the generality aspect, because part of what you want them to learn from that is to apply whatever they learn in class to other situations that they will run into in the future. And if a case is so unique that whatever you talked about in that situation can't be applicable to other situation, then it's much less useful in general.
Now, we mentioned short, or shorts written up here. What does that mean to people when you think about a short case study? Because it's certainly relative to different people. What is a short case study?
Less than 30 pages.
Less than 30 pages. See, that's very interesting. David, what's a short one for you? Just a few pages. Okay. 3 to 5. And it's very different, right? It's gonna differ for disciplines. I'm sure David's are.
Well, I mean, depending on how we define case studies, some of our cases are a page or 2 pages when we just talk about the case method, but then the integrated one we did ended up being hundreds of pages of material, but that was for a different purpose.
And so it depends how you're using it. And when David talks about that longer case study, also that wasn't all. What's not all they did for an entire. They did it on and off, so it was more
For a
of the
whole semester,
interruptive, right? But I did. I just as an example, I did a case study for the first time this past semester, and with a graduate level toxicology class, and it was okay, but it was kind of a bomb because it was too long. It lasted too long. It was a case study on coal, and it was both toxicology and epidemiology, and it was an interrupted case where they would do parts in a group and then come back together and discuss it, and then go back, and then they would do research outside of the classroom and come back the next class and it went on for too long. And we established that at the end. I was like, I need to chop this in half. But they got great information out of it. It just was too long. So you need to think about, and when it is an interrupted case, we'll kind of talk about the types of cases in a minute. Interrupted and then continuing on with it, or interrupted and then doing some lecture, interrupted and then taking a break and they're done with that class that day. How you're interrupting it, how much break time you have in between there. Are they immersed in this same case for 5 classes, which is what mine was, and I learned, no, that's not a good thing. But anyway, you learn from it too, what works in the class, and certainly in smaller groups or in smaller classes, that actually could be an okay thing, but in my class it didn't fly. So I did learn that like a 2 to 3 class case study actually worked really well with that class, and that's something that you have to feel out for your class size and for the discipline and what works. Sometimes a case is great for just like a quick little 30-minute discussion. That's it. It's like a trigger, a jumping off point for some kind of content that you want to get them into. You use it as a jumping off point. It's a short little case. So anyway, the short is relative, is my point. I think we want to get into talking about the different types of cases now. And what we're going to do is we're going to, thank you. So we put some of the list, some of the types of cases up here, but there are certainly other ones. Like I said, this isn't exhaustive. It's and also it's funny too. Some people are like, well, I teach this kind of case. It may or may not fall under one of these categories. So when we kind of go through what the types of cases are, you might say, oh, actually, my type of case that I'm teaching actually falls under these categories. Perhaps the most common one, or the one that people are most comfortable teaching or starting to teach, is the discussion method. And I think David's going to talk a little bit about his examples of using the discussion method to teach cases. But then also we want you guys to jump in. If you have experience teaching with this method, please offer examples because other people can benefit as well.
What I was just going to mention, since the law school is known for teaching case studies, I thought I would let you know a little bit about what the case method is. And it was already mentioned that one of the reasons why we use case methods is because the law itself comes in cases. So it's both for the, unlike in some disciplines, it's both the substance of the case itself is what they're supposed to be learning, the law that comes from it. But the so-called Socratic dialogue, or method that's the foundation of, particularly first year and foundation of the traditional law school teaching, is based on a case method in which we have some advantages. First off, all of our cases are written for us. One of the disadvantages is that they're all written by the same set of people, appellate judges, and they have a certain purpose. So, which is to explain why they decided the opinion the way they did. So they're argumentative in a way, and they come from a certain perspective, usually elitist, and often in an argument way that masks only part of the narrative in the story. So we have some inherent problems with what we do, but just to generalize so that you know how it's structured, is that students, as they enter the law school, are imbued with a methodology for how to read a case. And it's meant really to tie to the critical thinking. I'll get to the discussion aspect of it in a minute, but and early on they're given a taxonomy, or not a taxonomy, but a format for how to read cases. And I think this is somewhat important in that the cases aren't just sort of laid out there, but they're told that they're supposed to read a case and look for identify and think about what are the facts, what is the particular holding of the case, what are the reasonings for why the judge did that, and then what are the generally applicable rules and how are they applied in that. So that the students are starting to have a format, so as they read a case, they're supposed to be thinking about it all in a kind of unified way. And they're also very much encouraged to not only have read the cases before they come to class, which we enforce with the calling on them blindly, but also they're very encouraged to have working groups and small study groups and to be talking about the cases both before and after class. So part of that is sort of implied in it. In the actual classroom, as far as the discussion goes, it forces us as teachers to, we engage in the so-called Socratic dialogue, which is a question and answer dialogue. It forces us out of a lecture format. It has that value, as it I think is generally applicable. You don't have to use it all the time, as we tend to do every day in first year. But it does. The way that we still do it, it's a question and answer or an answer and question, depending on how we set it up. I do more of a reverse Socratic, where I use the whole class as the discussion, and then I take questions as we go along. It has the unnerving quality of not being scripted, but it has a valuable quality of being able to go in the direction the class wants to go and try to sense that. And from this process over time, the ultimate goal is that we're hoping to teach the students the critical thinking of how to take general rules and apply them to new different factual aspects. This should be somewhat familiar to many different disciplines, and go the other way. Take a variety of general or specific cases and be able to induce a more general legal theory out of it, which is the practice of lawmaking in the common law. But as also emphasized as less did you get the rule of law out of this case study than were you able to sort of analyze the case and the different aspects of it. What are the relevant facts? What are irrelevant facts? Why were they relevant? Why were they not? With the outcome, hopefully, that by the end of the first year, they're thinking like lawyers, whatever that means. One of the things it may mean, and one of the criticisms of this particular way of case studies, as I mentioned before, is that the narratives are all pre-packaged. You learn Plessy versus Ferguson. You learn the law out of Paul's graph for the different cases. And because they're written by, all written by the same elite set of players in the legal system, judges, the case studies have been criticized and trying to bring in a different narrative, a different story, the power of narrative, and what is the story that's not being told about these figures. Because the fun thing about the law school case is that every case has a story behind it if you can unpack. Who were the people? What was going on? What's the gendered aspects of this case? What's the racial aspects? What's the economic and class aspects? So you can use it to, depending if you want to expand more, but most of that is not given in our cases. Most of that would require you to do the outside research and bring it out, and so you do that some of the time and not all the time. But it is set up to be the discussion with the whole class following it, and pretty much still guided through the instructor. We do, unfortunately, we're a little reluctant to use more in-class time for smaller group discussion or smaller dialogue. That's sort of becoming new in law school. I'll stop there, but maybe others want to.
Well, you mentioned the small group work, and that's certainly a way. I use small group work a lot in case studies, and sometimes it's think pair, share, square, think pair, square, share. And sometimes it's just working in pairs, and sometimes it's working the entire time in a group of 3, or possibly 4, but I try to keep it to 3. So, and when that happens, sometimes the discussion only takes place in the group, and I float around, depending on how big the class is. Or sometimes they work in their groups, and then we come together and we discuss as a class. So as they're working through the case, they might be working through some questions and some reading the narrative, working through some questions, doing some research, and then coming back together to discuss as a bigger group. So the discussion method can work in lots of different ways, but I do it for different types of science, and it works well also. And it is, like I said, it is perhaps the most common and the most I wouldn't say easy, but it's the most approachable form to just jump in and try it. And you could do it on a very small scale, something very simple. And we will provide some resources for you guys. I've posted a bunch of stuff to Blackboard, and then also we'll talk about it at the end of the class to get started if you want to start using some cases. Buzz, did you want to add anything to the discussion part?
Just maybe a couple of things. One, for the small group discussion, that I find that many students are more comfortable in small size groups. There are students that basically never talk when I have a discussion in the entire class. But if there are small groups of 3 or 4 students and walking around, and I can hear them participating much more in these groups. So it allows some students that are shy, don't want to express themselves in the entire class format to do that in a small group. And another thing that we'll mention later probably about the structure of the class, oftentimes the structure of the classroom itself dictates what you can do and what you can't. So one example is last semester I was assigned a class. I had like 24 students. I think I was assigned a classroom in Ward 2. To those of you who know it, it's like a huge hall. The chairs are set in place. You can't do anything. So anything that has to do with small group discussions, I did it nevertheless. I said, okay, group number 1, go to that corner of the hall, and group number 2. But it's really not conducive to this kind of cases, and of course the institution doesn't really take that into consideration many times. But that's.
Yeah, when you you have to ask for a specific room assignment pretty early on, and sometimes they still can't accommodate. But so I guess we can go on, and does anyone have any other discussion examples that they've used in the class? Yeah.
I want to bring up something else, but case studies as research tools.
Mm-hmm.
And I generally have the opinion that disciplines that are weaker quantitatively, like international relations, use case studies more because that's how we get information, how we compile it. For example, one of the most important research tools in IR is Correlates of War from David Singer, which is a list of all the wars since 1816. Boaz has a recent book where he uses case studies as the basis for his research. So is there a difference between using that for your own purposes and teaching a point versus using it as a way of showing scientific findings? And this gets down to the validity of research using case studies, especially the categorical ones that try to approximate some quantitative attributes. And the fact you can use some mathematical techniques like Jack's bootstrap and things like that to approximate samples to make populations and say this has the validity that we associate with mathematics and statistics.
I have some thoughts on that, but Boaz, do you want to answer that?
In my mind, it's very much related, the way you use it in class and the way you use it in research. Because part of what I want a student to learn is how to use cases for research. And my classes are mostly graduate classes, but I think it's valid also for undergrads. So I'm going to talk in a second about cases as theory testing tool or mechanism. So basically, I think about it, the kind of pattern of thinking that goes into cases for research and cases for teaching is fairly similar. Of course, you need to kind of tweak with that because you do have other goals in teaching as well. But, yeah.
I mean, as far as the quantitative aspect goes, I really, that's largely why I started using case studies with my gen ed non-major courses, because I could get them interested in things that and using all sorts of, I have them do statistics and they have to do conversions and they do things that I don't have them do in the regular classroom necessarily because they are very reluctant to and they push back. But in the cases they're working through it. They have some sort of stake or it's relevant to them, and they work through it. And so
Can you give an example of what you do in your
Sure. So the first case study that I ever used and that I still use because it worked very well was mercury as a toxicant, and it's written in a very simple way about a woman who goes out to lunch with her friend, and she just learned that she was pregnant, and I did this with undergrads, so even though it's not real life, they probably know someone or a sister that so even though might not have gone through the situation, they can at least relate to it. And they're just sitting there chatting, and then she's thinking about what to order for lunch. And she's deciding between 2 different kinds of fish. It's a very simple scenario, the beginning part. And then it gets into, well, and her friend says something to her, like, maybe you want to actually consider, I read this, or I heard on the news that maybe, when you're pregnant, you shouldn't eat tuna. So maybe you want to pick the other fish. And she was like, okay, I don't know anything about it, so I'll just pick the other fish. But then later she emails another friend, and there's like an email trail, and it's a friend that works at the EPA, and the EPA sends her some data, and it's a graph, and she has to understand the graph. And so then they have to, and then she asks her for more information, and they have to do a unit conversion to actually find out whether or not that level of mercury that was in the tuna is actually harmful, and should they avoid it. And so that's
I might
it.
have liked my science classes more if they were taught
So that was
way.
the first one that I used, and it was only a 1 class. I mean, I had them do a little bit of the reading outside, but just the first scenario that only took about 10 minutes outside of the classroom. And then when they come to the classroom, I have them work in groups on that. I actually have done it with co-guide students, master's level students also, and they get a lot out of it, but we work through it a lot quicker. And but it's okay, because the tools, at least the quantitative part of it, these are things that other science classes are not necessarily asking non-majors to do, and I want them to be able to do these things. Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could maybe go back to when you're saying working through the case study and
Mhm.
how you really teach that, and anybody else, like teach that in the classroom. I know you mentioned small groups and questions.
Mhm.
Do you provide the questions, and how do you get the most out of it in the classroom?
So I can speak to this one case, and then have other. Do you want to say first? Go
I've got
ahead.
a quick one.
Yeah.
It's really easy. I use it to teach journalism ethics, and I have got a file drawer full of case studies where there's a question in the newsroom about what is ethical, whether to print the name of a rape victim and it's all done in a detailed story, very identifiable, where you've got characters who are the reporters and the editors, and they have different opinions. And I give the same case study to 5 different groups in the class, and they work together and come up with a solution, the ethical solution, and they defend it. And then they compare and inevitably, they're different. And it's a great teaching tool for, it's not that simple, with a topic like ethics. It really you can stand up all day long and tell them that ethical decisions are not simple, but the case study way is the best that I've ever found. And then we do one every week for 4 or 5 weeks. We do different topics that are really likely to come up that most journalists see in their careers.
You bring up a really interesting point too, of being able to have them come back together and not necessarily agree, because you can use this as a tool to do a debate. They all do their research and they come back together, and then you can actually have a debate, and we'll kind of get to that a little bit, like Boaz's Court of History as well too. But you could use it as a tool to actually have them defend their stance. But I mean, and for the tuna case, I gave them a narrative that I actually post everything on Blackboard. I never hand out papers, but I post it on Blackboard. They go home, they read it. When they come back to class, then I have the next part posted on Blackboard. They use their laptops in the class, or a tablet or something. And then they work through the questions. I have questions for them, and I have the data for them. They work through the data. And then they submit on Blackboard as we're working through it in the classroom. So as far as the material, the content that I want them to have before they get to the case, I post lectures online, so I use it more as a flipped classroom, and I post my lectures online, and they watch them whenever they want to, and they read the textbook material outside of the classroom, and then when we come into the classroom, we work through the activities together, or they work through them in groups together, I should say, and then I float around and answer questions and things like that. So it's a lot of prep, but once it's there, you have a file drawer full of cases to pull from. You do have to keep them updated, if you want them to be current and relevant, you do have to keep them updated, but if they are real life things that actually happen, you usually can just update them, update the data or whatever has been changed.
Where do you get yours from? Where do you
I
get
will,
your case-
so I'll point to that
okay.
at the end. No, it's fine. There's a couple case collections, and then I did start writing a couple of my own as well. Yeah.
I think one thing, this may not be at the root of your question, but one thing that it goes to sort of the obstacles or challenges. I mean, part of it is, I would say, is to start in a very small way. Part of it is the fear of like having to disrupt the class to move the tables around or to get people around. It's like, is it really going to be worth it? And I find myself sometimes just saying, I'm not going to do that case study this time around, just because it seems, and every time I do that, it's a mistake because the students enjoy it so much and they re-engage. So partly, it's not how do you get the most out of it, but part of it, I would say, I love the fact that you described having one that failed completely. I've had a couple bombs too.
Yeah.
And including the biggest one I ever did in some ways, but the simplest ones are sometimes the best, just to break them up and get them talking to one another. I think your point about how people will participate better in a smaller group discussion than they will in the bigger group is really valuable.
You also give them questions to work through.
Yeah, that's one reason why I mentioned that even for each of our cases, they're given as they enter the school sort of a framework that allows them to work through them. Often the textbook will have separate questions, and then we discuss the questions as a group. But sometimes when I divide them into smaller groups, if it's very complex, like an ethical dilemma, or where there's where the answer is very less clear, then you present them with the questions and let them talk about it and come back. You just have to be willing to invest the time in the class.
What I sometimes do, I send them questions, specific questions to the case through Blackboard before the class, so they have time to kind of go through it, think about it more at home, and then they come into class and discuss in small groups.
I did want to say also, I've taught online a couple times too, and I have used them online as well. So again, you have to stay on top of it. I use discussion boards to actually, where they actually answer the questions and they work through it, and I've had them do online debates as well. And so it depends, that are based on a case. So it depends on what the class is, and there are different ways to facilitate it. And if we have time at the end, we can talk a little bit more about some of the logistics too, and even assessment and things. But let's get to the interrupted case, if you want to talk a little bit about that.
I'll just say, if people have questions about this example, but we did, so it's kind of unique in the setup that law students come in and they have the same professors for the first semester, so they have 4 classes, and we have all the same students. So that we have an integrated section, an effort in different ways to integrate them. But a couple years ago, we developed a case study which was very ornate and interrupted in the sense that we started almost in the very beginning of, the very first class, in which a client came in unannounced and sort of started a discussion about their case, which involved it was a very simple case. It involved drywall falling down on somebody while they were sleeping during the time when Chinese drywall was a bit of in the news and stuff for different reasons. And then the goal behind this case study was interesting in how you can use case studies, because we wanted to use it across the 4 classes, which included their legal and writing class, research and writing class, civil procedure, personal injury torts, and contracts. And so our goal was partly to get them to recognize that cases come in an integrated way, not siloed the way that we teach the classes. And secondly, to help them sort of integrate in the process and the skills of what a case looks like. So civil procedure, the course goes through the development of a case in real life, and we work this case study out so that they would have different pieces of information as they went through the course, starting with an interview. So it was all very practical oriented and skills based, in the sense that for the rest of law school, they get a case that's all kind of neat and nicely packaged and written by a smart judge, and here they get a really rotten interview transcript and they have to start pulling out the facts. And we went through all the different stages, from writing complaints and doing that, which they had to do as part of their legal research class anyways, but it was integrated into our substantive things, and we could use our class time to kind of go through the case study and things like that. So it was very interesting in the sense that it allowed us to integrate these different aspects and give them a more coherent picture of what it meant like to practice. So it was also allowed for simulated aspects. I will say it was a tremendous amount of work. I mean, this is the one that had hundreds of pages. It got doled out at different times, but we had to give them, after they wrote their complaint, we had to give them a model complaint. After they wrote this part, we'd have to give them something that they could go on. And it culminated in the end with a negotiated settlement, working in small groups and things. And I'll say, from our perspective, it was really interesting and worked very well. It was a tremendous amount of work. The students' complaint, which goes to your oversized, was compared to the other law students, their cohort that weren't in the experimental section, as they dubbed it, we didn't dub it that way. They felt like they did a lot more work, and they complained about it. So they liked it, but they didn't like the work, which I think was not even accurate. I'm not even sure it was more work, but it is something that I came to realize that it sort of goes to the size and scale.
Different work.
It's different work, and there was a mini revolt about how come they had to do this and the other
Everybody
students
should
did.
have had to do it.
Well, yeah,
Big
exactly.
mess up
But the
there.
problem, of course, was that not the other professors, we didn't all have agreement that we would all put in this extra time, because the coordination, I mean, we started in the summer to coordinate and
So were
such.
there tests in that class? Could you
Yes.
gauge which groups
So
were-
for the legal, no, you couldn't test across the different sections, but we all agreed that our evaluation would reflect the case study. So we told the students, as you invest time in this particular fact pattern, it won't be completely lost, and they would be evaluated in the research and writing course. So there was evaluation and assessment as part of that part as well.
Because there has been some research to indicate that high school students who engage in project-based learning, they do better on tests of, say, AP US history than the students who had the more classic.
I have no doubt, without any quantitative assessment, that the students had a richer experience than any other semester that I've had through that exercise. I mean, it was a really rich experience for them, but they resented it.
But you for sure that you did more work.
Anyways, I just wanted to share, because it does highlight the ability of case studies to cut across disciplines, and how you coordinate with another class is very difficult unless you're on the same schedule. But even putting that aside, being able to cover different subjects through the course of the semester, for example, in our case, the civil procedure professor, who knew they were going to go, her class was organized in the chronology of a case anyways, it would allow this interrupted method to introduce something and carry a stream through of learning through the whole thing, which you couldn't do very easily without the case study method.
Okay, so, so interrupted and discussion tend to be some of the more common types. And then this, Boaz is going to talk about theory testing, which is actually something that can be, it could be something that falls underneath other categories depending on how it's conducted. And it's a really interesting, it's an interesting way to approach a problem.
So first of all, my discipline, I guess, in international relations is one that is not consensual. There are very few agreements among scholars about what is right and what is wrong, which theory is right and what is wrong. So it's I think there are other disciplines that are like that, but there are some that are very different. So I use cases in quite a lot of time as a method in order to test theories. And I use two types of cases. Some of them are invented cases that I sort of like write something relatively short, a scenario, and ask the student to talk about. But in this case of theory testing, I use case in a much broader and I guess less formal way. So what I call case here is usually an historical case or even current, but real world case. And I usually don't have a summary of the case, written summary of the case, but I take the case, so let's say we study civil wars and theories about civil wars. So I can take the case of the war in Bosnia, and treat it as a case. I don't write a summary of the war in Bosnia. Instead, I send the students to read analysis of the war or history of the war, something that I'm going to talk in a second about the reading in particular. So the goal of this theory testing is basically to bring several theories of a certain phenomena. So it could be theories of civil wars, theories of crisis escalation, stuff like that, and to take a specific historical case or even sometimes current case. So civil wars, I can, for instance, look at the case of Syria that's going on right now, and say, okay, we have several competing theories about why civil war broke out, or under what conditions should we expect civil war to break, to start, and let's look at this particular case and see which of the theories are applicable and which are not. So I'm using it in that sense. I usually take two, so I'm teaching mostly graduate courses, masters, and I'm usually using two consecutive classes for this. In the first class, I have the students read before the class the theoretical part. So I have them read theories of crisis escalation, under what conditions we should expect the international crisis to escalate versus to calm down and end. So I have them read the theoretical part, and we discuss it in class, which is sort of like a regular class. Some of this will be a lecture, some of this will be a discussion with questions and back and forth. But my goal is for this first class that they will understand well what are the arguments out there, what are the hypotheses out there about this particular phenomena. Then I ask them to read before the second class material that has to do with the case. So it's usually history of the case, and it's usually I try to do it actually as less analytical as possible, so more descriptive history of the case, because in any analysis they would have already some theoretical assumptions. I think that in any history book they will have theoretical assumptions hidden. But basically I want them to understand from different perspective all the facts of this case, and I ask them to think about either usually I do it. I ask them to think about at home while they're doing the reading. Okay, we learn about several theories. We learn about competing theories, sometimes really conflicting theories about what are the conditions under which civil war starts. So for instance, in this case, there are theories that put the emphasis on the behavior of elite, and there are theories that looks at the masses, and there are theories that have to do with grievance, with the suffering of the people. There are theories that have to do with more called greed of a certain class of people or elite. So I asked them to think about each of these theories and draw inferences. If this theory is correct, what would I likely see in the case that I'm looking at? What is the evidence that I can expect to see if the theory is correct? What is the evidence that will probably falsify this theory, at least for this particular case, or make it weaker? And then in the class, we usually talk about it first in small groups. Sometimes given particular roles in the conflict. I'll talk about it later. Sometimes just talking about the cases, but basically, I want them to think as detectives, basically. I want them to think about, okay, I often give them an example. This is like you're the detective and this is a murder case. There are different suspects. It's kind of like Agatha Christie scene. There are different suspects. Each of them have different motives. Each of them have different opportunities to actually to actually kill the person. What kind of evidence are you looking to find in the case that will help you to determine which of the people in the room is actually responsible for the murder? And that's what we try to figure out through discussion of the case. Is there evidence for this particular hypothesis that is right or that is wrong? And through that, I'm trying to basically reach three goals, I guess. One is to actually learn the case, because mostly it's historical cases that are important cases that are, I think, are relevant. Second is to think about the theoretical aspect of this, which of the theories that we have in our field seems to be stronger and which weaker. And the third goal is to allow them to develop their own critical thinking and thinking about testing, and when they have, for instance, an assignment to write their own research paper, then they can look at a completely different case but apply the same kind of thinking. And here I think it connects to what Jim asked before about the relation between case study as a research method and case study in the classroom. So I think that applies here. We also usually discuss the difference between strong evidence and weak evidence. So I tend to think about this in terms of uniqueness and certainty. So a strong evidence is the case that is evidence that is both unique and certain. So it's certain because that's something that you certainly expect reading this particular theory, you certainly expect to find an evidence for this in the case. And unique evidence is that there are no or relatively few alternative explanation that can expect the same evidence to appear in the case. So we talk about this kind of okay, I have evidence. Is it a strong evidence? Is it a proof? Is it kind of a smoking gun, or is it an evidence that could be explained by other hypotheses, other explanations? So yeah, that's basically the way I work with this kind of case. Yeah.
But aren't the results potentially highly sensitive to which particular case you pick? When you say there are theories A, B, and C, the first case, when you look at it, says theory B, and the second case is C, and what you theoretically, I would think, want students to do is come up with an analysis of a whole series of cases and find the I don't know what you call it, the transcendent or the overarching principle.
Right. You're certainly right, and I think that I try to kind of nest these case studies within a kind of more general discussion of the topic and of the area, and see. So if there's quantitative research, good quantitative research on this area to show, usually after we're talking about the case, is this a typical case or something unique? But I think that in many cases, one of the things that is, in my mind, so effective in cases, that it allows you not only to look at these correlations between A and B, but to look inside and look at the mechanisms, how A and B are related together. What's actually happening in reality that connects them.
Hi, thank you. I'm gonna skip the trigger and capstone because just for time saving, since we only have about 13 minutes left. So I think that I think actually we might have to.
Just take questions, yeah.
Yeah, we can just take questions and talk about maybe some of the challenges, if that's okay. And then if we want to stick around and talk about some more examples afterwards, we can. But I think maybe talking about some of the challenges and potentially getting it off the ground, and then also showing you guys some of the resources that we have, and point you in different directions for cases, that might be helpful. So I think if you, I can actually, for those of you that have used cases, or those of you that actually, even just after talking about it today, think about some of the challenges that are inherent in using the cases in the classroom, or out of the classroom if you're online. Things that pop up as being a problem, and one of them Boaz already mentioned, and that's the physical space. The logistics of having a classroom space, if you're teaching in a classroom space that is amenable to moving it around into different groups, or if you have round tables, that's awesome. Like David was saying, he teaches, sometimes round tables, right? Or being able to at least move the chairs around. Like, we could have moved them around today, but I know that the session that's coming afterwards actually needs both these and needs the chairs. So anyway, we did not. But that's usually what I do. I get to my classroom beforehand and I move the chairs around. And then that's the deal, is in the classroom. We always have to put them back to where they came from before we leave. But the physical space is a real issue. Has anyone come into that problem when teaching with cases? Yeah? What is that?
And finally, they built a building where all the furniture was movable. And it's wildly popular, because this is really the way to go now, is to, configure the room in learning spaces.
And it's a problem, especially for large lecture spaces. And when you said you got stuck in Ward 2. I mean, I've been stuck in rooms too where I've had to stick them to different parts of the room, and you end up with where their bags are in the way when they're stepping over to go to different spaces, and are they still sitting here? Did they take all their stuff with them? And it's just like, it is a logistical kind of mess. So. I have found that working in groups, I do ask them to, when they come back to the classroom, to sit in those same groups if we're going to continue working on the case. And everyone has different approaches for group work, just in general, but that is a challenge also. How to handle group work. Do you keep them in the same groups for the entire semester? Do you change it up every time? I tend to change it up, especially with small classes. I change it up. If it's a really large class, logistically, it's actually a lot easier to keep them in the same groups. But then there's all sorts of the gripes and the problems. But then that kind of gets to assessment also. Assessment of using case studies as a teaching method is how do you then assess what's going on, right? I don't know, do you guys want to talk about how you handle assessment? Like, what do you do for testing or not testing?
We're so horrible in the law school about assessment that I don't want to talk about it, but I do want to say something about space. It's one of the big critiques of the. No, actually, one thing I'll talk about assessment in a minute. One thing about the space is, I think that I allow space to stop me from doing things that I shouldn't allow it to do. Like, we have big lecture, and the chairs aren't very movable, and they're sitting in a tiered. Yet, every time I say we're going to break into small groups, turn around and create groups of 5, they do it. It takes about 30 seconds. I'm a little embarrassed about the amount of time. And the reality is that once we're doing it, it works fine. It doesn't work great, but it works fine. And so don't let the physical space kind of prevent you from doing it, because you can still, second best is still sometimes better than having 2.5 hours of listening to me lecture or whatever it is. And, I mean, that's pretty good, but.
Any assessment thoughts?
I've kind of a flip on. One reason I'm here is that assessment is, for learning outcomes assessment, case studies are actually a very good way to do learning outcomes assessment.
Mm-hmm.
To know that they can apply what they learned.
Yes.
Right. well, in the example about the publishing the name of the crime victim, you would have the student tell you what they would do, and then based on what, and it would give you a really good idea of whether or not they've gotten the general principles of publishing names in crime cases. It's an easy way, actually, to assess what they have in here.
When we're using case studies though for assessment, is it most appropriate to assess cases that are prepared on an individual basis, or can they be used for assessment purposes if there was a group or a team that worked on the case?
That's a really good question.
I mean, I have some thoughts on that because I do most of my case study work in groups, but not all of it. Sometimes they'll do part of it individually and then come back together to work in a group. And it's difficult to assess. If there is a definite answer, then it's a little bit, you want them, the real world situation is that they are going to be working in teams. In many situations, not all the time, but in many situations, and they're going to be able to look up things. You want them to be able to look them up and evaluate that information, whether or not it's accurate, and synthesize it, make sense of it, and then use it for some sort of purpose, right? And so I feel like if they're able to give a correct answer in a group, that's a valid, mine are not always correct answer or incorrect answer. A lot of it is the synthesis, the process, like you say, of getting to some point.
That's right.
And being able to defend that with evidence, in my case, with evidence, and citing that evidence. Yeah. And so that's more what I'm looking for. And if they're able to do that in a group, that's fine. I do use peer evaluations for the groups, and I have them evaluate their peers, and they know that going into the group work also, and so they know that they're going to be evaluated by their peers ahead of time, and so it kind of removes some of that worry, that angst that they have of someone else not pulling their weight, or of them not being accountable, or of them all pulling all of the weight. So those are usually.
What role does their assessment play in your assessment?
So usually they get a grade. I'll grade whatever the product is. If it's questions and answers, if it's a synthesis, whatever it is, I'll grade that, and then their evaluations I take into account for their individual grade. So if say there's a group of the three of us, and I would evaluate the two of them. They would evaluate the other two people individually, and I usually it's a rubric and it's a little chart, and they give different numbers for like out of 100, and they would divide the 50 points between the two other people. So if I got lower points from both of them than from the other two, then I would adjust my grade accordingly. That's not an example because I'm talking about myself, but do you understand what I mean? Like the third person, if someone.
What percent of your assessment is their assessment?
I'm sorry, is the what?
What percent of the grade you're going to give is derived from the grade?
Well, I also, if it is glaringly, if it's a couple points, it's probably negligible and it's not going to make a difference. If it in the numbers. But if there is a huge discrepancy between people's evaluate, I'll have to meet with them sometimes. I also give an additional comments section, and I can usually figure out from those comments where this is coming from, and then I can talk to the people and find out what was going on. It's interesting how there's different stories in the group, but this doesn't happen very often. I mean, it really doesn't. Usually, just the fact that they have a peer evaluation takes care of someone not pulling weight. Or if something comes up, someone's grandmother died or whatever, about that, they incorporate it, and then I can, work with the other students accordingly.
20% of the grade you're giving them for that assignment is the input from the others? Is it 50%?
But you mean it's not necessarily a percentage because it's not always the same. So if my grade was someone gave me out of a 30 and then they gave David 70, then that would be something that I would have to adjust the grade. And yes, it depends on if that's out of 100 points, then it probably would be the discrepancy. The number of points would go down in the grade. But it depends on how different it is. I don't have like a percentage that it goes down because it's not, that is the exception. It's only happened probably twice.
The way I dealt with the assessment issue is basically to say I'm not gonna evaluate the performance in the case study except for considering them as a part of the participation part of the evaluation, which is not huge. But instead, I'm giving them as an assignment, a separate assignment in the class. Usually, in the graduate classes, is the main assignment to write a research paper about a case study, and this allows me to evaluate how much they learn from that, how much they can apply what we learn in class to other cases that they pick for their own with my permission. So I kind of bracketed the question of a group work assessment to the side, and I am looking at how much did you learn as an individual from this particular exercise that you can actually apply to other cases.
Can I say one thing about assessment, and that is, when students do case studies for me, sometimes I have a hard time assessing them. But one thing I do is, and I think this is similar to Boaz, is think about it as theory testing. And the example I use for them is like the Heisenberg principle, where Heisenberg said, if you shine a microscope on an atom, it changes the behavior of the atom. And the same thing happens in social sciences. And there was a famous book from the 60s, Tally's Corner, about a bar in DC a sociologist was looking into. And he wrote this book, and people said, but you going to this bar all the time changed the mechanics and had an effect on it. So I try to get them to do case studies where they take themselves out of it, their personal role if they're interviewing somebody, or to take their emotions out of it and really stick to the facts and telling the story and bringing all these elements together. And I haven't really found a lot of good sources. I use a book by Yin and quote from that, but there's not a lot of books out there that spell out what are good case studies and how you can assess that.
There's an assessment book called Classroom Assessment Techniques. It's a handbook for college teachers by Thomas Angelo and Patricia Cross, and it does address case study assessing with case studies. I mean, I found that I don't necessarily need to use the peer evaluations most of the time. It's the process of working through it, like Boaz said. I don't. Sometimes it is just participation, and sometimes it is they actually hand in a product. And if that product is gradable, then it's gradable. But if not, it is the actual process. If that's doable in a small class and being able to float around and really watch the process, that's great. But you can't always do that. So sometimes having a product that gets submitted or handed in or something actually does help with the assessment, I find. I mean,
Well, part of the assessment problem we're talking about is just for any group project, how do you assess, as opposed to, for case studies, as long as you give some thought to how that becomes an integral part of the assessment, what they learn during it can be reflected in many different ways.
I don't think I put the assessment book up there.
It
Oh, it is.
is.
It's up top
It's
there.
Angelo
Okay.
Cross.
Yeah, so
It's
that's,
a really good book. It's a good book.
Yeah. Oh, and then I also, this is just for, but this is for science, but this is a great book for case study teaching in the sciences. And then I posted some articles to the Blackboard site as well, and then I put links to but those are for science, the case study collections. And then there are some articles, if you go to the publications site on the bottom, that even though it's for teaching with science, teaching case studies with science, there are some very general articles on there about how to write your own case studies also. So if you're not coming into contact with finding cases that are already in existence, which you really can, I mean, you can probably grab anything out of the newspaper and turn it into a case that works for you. But if you're having problems, you can look at just some simple pointers on how to write your own cases, and starting very simply, like David and Boaz said too, starting really, really simply, and then and trying it, just one class or half a class, just something really simple to just get started. It's definitely changed my way of teaching. I really enjoy it a lot, and I wanted to mention the assessment, but I have found, even though that people do say assessment is a challenge, that it's not as much of a challenge for me as I had thought it would be. the process really lends itself to students learning material that they may have been reluctant to learn, or and certainly concepts and tools, like I was saying, you know, the quantitative tools that it's really amazing to get students that are reluctant towards some of these concepts to actually open their mind to it when it's something that's interesting or relevant to them.
I think if we were going to do a peer review of our group work here, she would get most of the points.
Yeah.
We're coming from different places too, so. But you can, my email's on there too, and you can email me if you have questions or anything.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.